there have been numerous occasions where unexpectedly the GM crop has been unexpectedly toxic or allergenic, when the non-GM crop that is not genetically engineered was absolutely fine in that regard. And all these changes are unexpected, they are unintended. Scientists really don't know what they're doing.
We all know that GMO foods are not good for us or the environment. But how do you effectively respond to your friends and family who believe otherwise? Hi, this is Dr. Mercola, helping you take control of your health. And today I am joined by Claire Robinson, who is the editor of GM Watch, which is based in the UK. And she is also the co-writer of a great new book, GMO Myths and Truths, which will help you answer the question I just asked. And let me give you my synopsis of the book before we start and listen to Claire. But I was really impressed with Stephen Drucker's book and the massive tome that he put together in really compiling information. But it was a bit long and somewhat bit challenging to get through. GMO Truths is more concise and to the point, and it can really give you some strong arguments and really arm you to effectively to counter all the nonsense that's out there. So we're really glad and grateful to have you here today, Claire, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a real privilege. The important thing when you're genetically engineering a plant is the new context of the gene that you're putting in. So even if you take a gene out of apples and put it into apples, as is the case with the Arctic genetically modified apple, you don't really know what that's doing, because all of a sudden the gene is in a new context. You've also created the possibility of mutations in the genome. The very process of inserting the gene will damage the genome, and that can create unexpected toxicity, allergenicity. It can change the biochemical pathways in the plant, so it has different nutrition or it's less nutritious. So all these things can still happen even if you're pulling the gene from the same plant that you're trying to genetically engineer.
And it seems as sort of a validation of that argument is that, and I think many people are aware of this, that when they create these new genetic mutants, that it's not just one specific plant that grows up. Not a plant would be the wrong term, but genetic variant, I guess, would be the more precise term. And in fact, there might be dozens or hundreds, and then they grow these in large greenhouses, I would assume, and then a fair percentage of those will die because those genetic alterations are toxic and lethal. And so they are only self-selecting the ones that are actually able to survive.
Yes, indeed. Genetic engineering is a very wasteful process. So you create an enormous number of plants that are deformed, infertile, they just don't grow well. There is a huge wastage involved. In fact, one of the scientists that I'm in contact with happened to see some of the genetically modified salmon that were created, and he said it was really shocking because there were salmon that were green in color, there were salmon that had lumps all over their bodies, and all these had to be thrown away. It's a very, very wasteful process. When we're talking about GM animals particularly, I think it's a very cruel process because you're creating so many non-viable animals and you just have to basically dispose of them. But genetic engineering is a difficult thing to do to plants. The plant genomes resist being genetically engineered, and this is why it's so very wasteful. Very, very few of those plants are going to be viable. The genetic engineer will pick some that he thinks look okay and that grow okay. But of course that says nothing about the potential toxicity, allergenicity, or any potential effects on the environment. The idea that genetically modified foods are safe has even taken root among some of the environmental NGOs. It's kind of worrying. I don't really understand it because we have been putting out there news of the animal feeding studies with GM crops for many, many, many years. A few people have taken that on board. but an awful lot of people have not. And this includes particularly a lot of journalists. We see journalists all the time saying, oh, well, GM crops are safe, but there may be other reasons why we should oppose them, but they are safe to eat. In fact, there are quite a number of animal feeding studies which have been performed where one group of animals has been fed a GM crop and the other group of animals has been fed a non-GM crop that is identical in every other way. And time again, what has happened is that the animals eating the GM crop have got sick. In particular, liver and kidney toxicity and immune responses. I think we're all concerned about the state of people's immune systems these days. It obviously is a huge concern. And I think any substance that you feed to a laboratory animal and you get an immune response, you really have to ask more questions about it. One thing about, you were mentioning aspartame, and that is a very interesting example. We can say that aspartame at least went through probably some long-term animal testing, I would think.
No, it didn't. Never did. It's the same darn issue with GM foods. This safety issue is all short-term. They know. I'm confident that these companies knew that there was toxicity if you extended out the length of the trial and the lifespan of the animal, and they cut it short just below that point where the damage occurs. Well, which is exactly what they did with sucralose and aspartame. There was no long-term studies, none. The long-term study was the human population, just administering it without testing.
That's a very interesting thing to hear. That should be an example to us, to demand long-term testing on GM foods. It's interesting that you said that the companies knew when to cut short the testing. There seems to be an agreement among the biotech industry that they do not like to test GM foods longer than 90 days in a rat, which is about 7 to 8 to 9 years in a human. It's really no time at all. So the long-term tests have not been done. Occasionally, some independent scientists have managed to do some long-term tests on a GM food. They usually find something bad. They normally find problems with the GM food. And clearly, this should be done with all GM foods. The European regulatory authorities, I think they are probably fairly unusual in the world in that they do demand a 90-day test in rats, feeding trial, but that really is nothing. Typically what you see is that even in those tests, the industry tests for 90 days in a rat, typically you will see liver and kidney toxicity and immune responses in those rats fed the GM food. And what happens is that they just dismiss the findings. They say, oh, these are not biologically relevant findings and we don't need to do longer testing. And this is a really, really worrying phenomenon. And really, we should be doing long-term testing and multi-generational testing as well with all GM foods. The
unscientific, dishonest, and I believe highly unethical claim that Americans, the claim that's been used to justify the use of these GM crops, is that Americans have eaten millions, hundreds of millions of GM meals with no ill effects. Well, that is just beyond flawed, because there's no way to ever even understand if that is true, because these crops are not labeled. They have no idea who is eating them. So why don't you respond to that?
Absolutely. You're correct. The place where most GM foods are eaten, which is North America, Canada, and the US, the GM crops are not labeled. The GM foods are not labeled, and therefore nobody knows who is eating how much GM crops in their diet. Nobody has a clue. So the idea that somehow we can know that Americans are fine, even though they've been eating GM crops, is completely unscientific, because it is not possible to trace who is eating what. And actually, one thing that we do know about Americans over the past few decades is that they have been getting sicker and sicker. Chronic diseases have been increasing, and nobody knows if there is a link to GM food consumption because they're not labeled. So the scientists can't actually track what could be causing that. Certainly, we cannot rule out GM foods. We can't say that they are not causing this problem. One of the myths that everybody seems to believe about GM crops, even the people who don't want to eat GM crops and who tell me that they oppose them, they say as an afterthought, oh, but we have to have them to feed the world, don't we? This is based on the myth that GM crops are somehow these super futuristic crops that are going to yield huge amounts of food. However, that is not the case. GM crops do not yield more than non-GM crops. There is no GM gene for high yield. The GM genes, as we've mentioned before, are for herbicide tolerance and to produce an insecticide. And there is no way of genetically engineering high yield into a crop. What you can do is you can increase yields very often by conventional breeding. And a high-yielding GM crop is simply a crop that has been conventionally bred to yield very good yields, and then the genetic engineers have come in and they've put on top of that a herbicide-tolerant gene or an insect-resistant gene. So really, the USDA even admits that yield is something that depends on the background genetics of the crop. It is not dependent on the genetic engineering. And in some cases, in fact, GM crops can yield less than the non-GM equivalent. And that is certainly the case with soy, where there is what is known as a yield drag with the GM soy. It yields less than the non-GM soy. And nobody really knows why that is. It's possible that the genetic engineering means that the plant's energy is somehow used up in resisting herbicide, for example, and it has less energy left over to actually do what plants are supposed to do, which is to grow and to feed us.
Well, it certainly could be one issue, and the other is the potential possibility is that you've screwed up the genetics. You have no idea of how the highly complex and sophisticated interactions have been impaired by this non-specific genetic engineering. Yes. And then I think ultimately, though, what's even more of a significant issue, and is really quite obvious once you understand regenerative agriculture, is that you are literally destroying the microbial health of the soil. I mean, that's what these herbicides do. And ultimately, you need the microbes in the soil to nourish the plant, and it's this mutual symbiotic interrelationship that provides good yields. And that's from a long-term strategic perspective, it's one of the worst things you can do for farming. It really is, because you're destroying the topsoil and the life of the soil, and ultimately, when you continue with this strategy, it will fail. It's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. It's prescription for disaster.
We do know that putting glyphosate herbicide on the soil actually ties up nutrients within the soil. It makes them less available to the plant and less available to us when we eat those plants. So it's a very, very serious thing, killing the soil. And another bit of research that came out quite recently is that the World Health Organization's cancer agency, IARC, actually defined glyphosate as a probable carcinogen. So over 80% of GM plants are engineered to be sprayed with glyphosate. They do have residues in them, so if you're eating those GM plants, you're eating a potential carcinogen.
It isn't just glyphosate.
Yeah.
Glyphosate is the active ingredient. But what's worse are those darn surfactants they put in there, which collectively is called Roundup. So I'm getting away from calling it glyphosate. It sounds more scientific, but it's not really accurate, because with glyphosate plus surfactant, known as Roundup, is over 100 times more toxic than glyphosate alone.
Yes, you're completely correct. The added ingredients in herbicides and pesticides are called adjuvants. They're very toxic in themselves, and they're designed to actually increase the toxicity of the so-called active ingredient. So Roundup, the complete formulation as it's sold, is much, much more toxic, as you say, than glyphosate, which is just the active ingredient in the herbicide.
So I believe just recently glyphosate has became the most used herbicide in the history of mankind.
Yes.
I think it's like 20 million tons, like with 10 million tons being used in the US alone, maybe 20 million tons worldwide. So that's a lot. And one of the other justifications and claims for the pro-GMO enthusiasts are that by the use of these technologies, we're able to reduce the amount of herbicides and chemicals being used. And that's another piece of nonsense. So why don't you address that one?
Yes, it certainly is one of the major myths. GM crops have increased the use of pesticides, and that's mostly because of herbicide-tolerant crops, which are designed to be sprayed with huge amounts of herbicide and to survive that spraying. So it shouldn't come as any surprise to us to read the research of Dr. Charles Benbrook, which has shown that because of GM crops, we have sprayed 7% more pesticides than we would have done if those same acres had been planted to non-GM crops. That may not sound like a lot, 7% may not sound like a lot, but in fact it's 404 million pounds of extra pesticides that have been sprayed. So really, people who tell you that GM crops reduce pesticides, it is nonsense. Also, another factor that we have to take into consideration is the spread of superweeds. As you spray more and more of this glyphosate herbicide on the GM crop fields, just through selection pressure, evolution, the weeds become more and more resistant to that herbicide. So now there's over 61 million acres of US farmland which is choked up with glyphosate-resistant superweeds. And of course the farmer's answer to that has to be to spray more herbicides. That's what they do. They're not just spraying glyphosate on those weeds now because the weeds don't respond to glyphosate. They're spraying things like dicamba, 2,4-D, which is an ingredient of Agent Orange. Some seriously toxic herbicides are now being sprayed in order to counter these superweeds.
And it's not getting better. It's only going to get worse, which is exactly what you would predict when you implement this type of disastrous scenario.
The whole reason why GM crops are pushed so relentlessly, in spite of the fact that they don't yield more, they don't reduce pesticide use, they're not fantastic for climate change, all these things, they are still pushed. Why is that? The reason is because they are very, very easy to patent. And when you patent a GM crop, you don't only own the rights on that particular crop, you also own the breeding rights. So every crop that is bred from that GM crop, as long as your proprietary patented genes are in that progeny, you own the progeny as well as the original crop. So really, patenting is a great means of consolidating control over the food supply by a few big companies.
So a rational response to that might be, a confused consumer would be, well, why doesn't the government protect us? And I'd like you to respond to this from the perspective of the understanding of the revolving door between industry and government that essentially has captured the United States Department of Agriculture, which in practical reality is now a mere extension of Monsanto and these other chemical giants that implements and enforces their recommendations.
Yeah, it's true. And things are particularly bad in America, where there is a revolving door between the American regulatory agencies like the US FDA and Monsanto.
More than enough hard data that has already been compiled to easily justify discontinuation of this intervention strategy. And that pretty much every other attempt to discredit that is fatally flawed and backed by industry.
I
So
totally agree with you. I think we have enough data.
yes, that's the case. So I want to thank you and congratulate you for your ongoing efforts with GM Watch and continue to
Thank you.
educate the public and the world about this, because it is an international site. And having compiled this book, GMO Truths, Myths, and Truths, which I believe is a phenomenal resource, should be in anyone's library who has any interest in this, especially in discussing it with others, because it just never ceases to surprise or astonish me might be the most accurate description of my response to the comments of some of our videos on YouTube that just there's a significant portion of the population who has fallen to this deceptive madness, who
Yeah.
sincerely believe that we're the Luddites, that we're just irrational, when if we only knew more and weren't ignorant, we would easily come to to see the light. So there's the bulk of the population. So you need a weapon, tools in your arsenal to counteract the misinformation that they are spewing. And your book is really one of the best ones out there. So thank you for writing it.
Thank you so much. And it's available on Amazon.
All right, as all good books should be. All right, well, you keep up the great work.
Thank you so much.